What truly happens when loyalty collides with destiny on a tower high above the sleeping castle? The air bites with cold, torches flicker against stone, and somewhere in the dark, two minds sharpen like blades. You probably won't survive this, but you'll understand it. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. I'm really curious, from which part of the world are you watching this video? Write your country in the comments. Let's see how far this little story has traveled. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. You step off that imagined tower and into the soft dusk surrounding the Gaunt family's decaying shack, the kind of place that looks like it failed its own structural integrity exam centuries ago. Its roof sagging like a disappointed professor, and its door hanging on a single hinge that squeaks with dramatic flair every time the wind brushes past. You feel the ground crunch beneath your feet, and for a moment you wonder if the earth itself is whispering the Gaunt name, old and bitter, and full of the kind of pride that lasts longer than good sense. A pride rooted so deeply in their ancient Slytherin ancestry that even the ministry once shrugged and said, yes, technically they're purebloods, but maybe don't visit without backup. You notice the air is unusually cold here, colder than the already brisk evening, as if the family's memories are refrigerating the landscape, and you can't help but make a mental note that even ghosts would probably ask for a warmer, haunting assignment. But lingering beneath the gloom is something else. An unspoken tension wrapped around the Gaunt legacy like a magically overactive garden vine, twisting history, resentment, and superstition into a single knot no historian has untangled without muttering the phrase, open scholarly debate, at least twice. You take a step closer, half expecting the shack to hiss insults in Parseltongue, and you realize this is where the cursed bloodline first begins to breathe again in your imagination, old dust rising like a reluctant welcome as you cross the threshold into the story of a family that clung to its past so tightly it forgot how to live its present. You step deeper into the Gaunt shack, where the walls seem to sag inward as though trying to escape their own family history. Each cracked stone looking like it's reconsidering all its life choices up to this moment, and your eyes catch the glint of Marvolo Gaunt's ring resting on a dusty shelf, as if it's still auditioning for the role of most ominous heirloom in Britain. The air smells faintly of mildew, regret, and the kind of cleaning neglect that would make even a house elf file a complaint. And as you move closer to the relics scattered around the room, you start to understand how fiercely the Gaunts clung to their ancestry. They treated their lineage the way some people treat limited edition chocolate frog cards, priceless, irreplaceable, and far more valuable than common sense. One of the cracked floorboards creaks beneath your foot, a long theatrical groan that perfectly mirrors your own reaction to remembering that this family once bragged about being direct descendants of Salazar Slytherin, while simultaneously living in conditions that suggested a particularly unfriendly troll was their interior decorator. Still, the ring itself holds your attention in that strangely hypnotic way cursed objects tend to do, gleaming with both history and unresolved arguments, and you can almost hear a distant echo of Marvolo shouting about blood purity, while the ministry quietly updated their notes with, please remind him yelling doesn't improve his housing situation. Yet even here, in this room of broken walls and louder egos, a curious detail pokes at the edge of your thoughts. The ancient stone on the ring, rumored to carry not just symbolic weight, but a connection to old magic so peculiar that some scholars call its lineage a matter of open scholarly debate, which is historian code for, we've argued about this for 60 years and still can't agree. You brush dust from a nearby cabinet, noticing a tiny snake carving etched into the wood, a fringe detail that suggests the Gaunts decorated with exactly two themes, snakes and bitterness, and you can't help but crack a smile as you imagine the family motto being something like, please take off your shoes, but keep your generational trauma. As you step back toward the doorway, the shack seems to exhale around you, as if relieved to have a visitor who isn't yelling about heritage, and you realize that these rings and relics aren't just artifacts, They're the fragile remains of a family that held onto their past so tightly that the future slipped straight through their fingers. You follow the narrow dirt path behind the Gaunt shack until the trees gather close enough to feel like they're staging an intervention, their branches arching overhead with that dramatic swoop forests love to do when they're trying to look mysterious. And as you step beneath the canopy, the air thickens with the memory of Marvolo Gaunt, who once stormed through these woods with the confidence of a man who believed shouting parcel tongue at wildlife was a valid form of exercise. Leaves crunch beneath your feet in crisp little bursts, each one sounding like a tiny polite cough, reminding you that this forest has witnessed centuries of tempers, curses, and one particularly infamous afternoon when Marvolo apparently tried to intimidate a ministry official with nothing but volume and a questionable understanding of law enforcement procedures. A squirrel darts up a tree, pausing halfway, as if reconsidering the wisdom of being seen in a forest with this reputation, and you sense the lingering unease that hangs here, the way some families hang portraits of relatives who never smiled. It's an inherited discomfort, one that has soaked into the bark and roots with stubborn determination. You breathe deeply, catching the faint scent of damp moss and unresolved family issues. And you can't help but note how even historians describe this place with phrases like unsettling atmosphere, lingering tension, and, in one memorable academic paper, the emotional equivalent of a cursed teapot, which remains one of the finest scholarly insults ever published. A bird calls overhead, startling you just enough that you mutter a quiet joke to yourself about how you should probably deduct house points for loud forest behavior, and you imagine Marvolo stomping through these trees, clutching his ring as fiercely as kids today clutch their limited edition chocolate frog holograms. One mainstream historical fact floats into your mind. By the early 20th century, several wizarding families in the region had reported strange echoes, whispers, hisses, and the occasional distant crash. Sounds locals attributed either to the Gaunt's presence or to the forest itself developing a personality disorder. Yet among those echoes, one fringe tidbit refuses to fade. The old belief that certain patches of these woods remember magic so deeply that they hum softly under the full moon. A claim so unusual it has become an open scholarly debate for decades, especially among academics who enjoy arguing about moonlit shrubbery. As you push deeper into the forest, the air cools sharply, and for a moment you feel as though the trees themselves are tightening around you, tugging at your sleeves like insistent children wanting to show you where Marvolo once carved his fury into bark, a furious spiral still visible on a decaying trunk. You run your fingers across the carved grooves, imagining his anger radiating through the woods like an unwanted family newsletter, and you realize the forest doesn't merely remember Marvolo. It resents him slightly, the way anyone would resent a neighbor who uses the entire woodland as a personal shouting arena. You step back, the shadows shifting around you with the slow patience of old magic, and you understand that this place isn't just a backdrop to the Gaunt story. It's a living archive of everything they couldn't contain, a quiet keeper of the rage, pride, and sorrow that shaped the cursed bloodline long before Tom Riddle ever opened his eyes. You move out of the forest and into the narrow, overgrown lane that once led to the hedgerows where Morphin Gaunt practiced magic with all the precision of a malfunctioning wand shop window display, his spells sputtering through the air like angry fireflies that never received proper instructions. And as you follow the faint remnants of those magical trails, you sense the static hum that still clings to the soil, the way old enchantments tend to linger long after their caster has stopped terrorizing the neighborhood with unsolicited wand demonstrations, each pulse reminding you that Morphin didn't cast spells so much as he hurled them at the universe in hopes something interesting would happen. The hedges rise around you in wild, bristling walls, their branches tangled so tightly they resemble the kind of hairstyle you get after falling asleep on a broom during a particularly turbulent night flight. And somewhere deep within their twisted mass, a faint sparkle flickers, the last residue of one of Morphin's more enthusiastic magical outbursts, preserved like an accidental historical exhibit no curator asked for. You step closer, the air thickening with a metallic buzz that prickles your fingertips, and you picture Morphin standing here, narrow-eyed and restless, his wand raised with a confident flourish that suggested he believed aim was optional, his spells carving unpredictable paths through the hedgerows and occasionally setting off sparks that startled passing insects into filing noise complaints with the nearest magical authority. A light joke bubbles up in your mind as you imagine Morphin applying for a ministry license and being politely escorted out of the building before he even reached the front desk, and you can almost hear the hedges whispering their own commentary in rustling leaves, the plants still recovering from decades of unsolicited magical haircuts. One mainstream historical fact steadies your thoughts. By the early 20th century, the ministry had documented 13 separate incidents in this exact area involving accidental explosions attributed to Morphin's magic, none of them serious enough to cause evacuation, but all significant enough that local owls revised their flight paths, preferring to avoid aerial risks associated with stray stunners. The air shifts, carrying with it a faint scent of singed nettles and something reminiscent of old potion fumes, the kind that cling to your clothes for days and make people subtly step back when you enter a room, and you sense the residue of Morphin's life pressing around you. Years spent in restless isolation, muttering to himself in a mix of parcel tongue and irritation, his spells filling the silence the way others might fill it with music or gardening. A thin trail of scorched grass curves toward the edge of the lane, a mark that looks too deliberate to be natural, as if Morphin once tried to draw something meaningful and abandoned it halfway through, distracted by a beetle or a passing thought, and you picture him kneeling there, carving symbols into the earth with his wand, not because they were important, but because they gave him something to focus on besides the heavy quiet of the Gaunt household. You trace the line with your eyes, noting how it fades near the roots of an old oak tree, its trunk split slightly down the middle from an ancient magical blow, one of those early spells so poorly aimed that the ministry later added a training guideline advising young wizards not to practice while angry, distracted, or in possession of a wand older than their grandparents. A small fringed tidbit stirs in your memory. The rural belief that certain trees could absorb leftover enchantments and occasionally release them in the form of unexpected shivers or glowing patches, a claim eccentric enough to remain in constant academic limbo and often labeled an open scholarly debate, especially by researchers who enjoy arguing about whether vegetation can develop magical mood swings. You press deeper along the path, feeling the magic underfoot thicken into a dull vibration, and you imagine Morphin's excitement each time he felt a spell crackle through his wand, that split second of satisfaction before the spell veered off course and reduced a hedge to smoldering confetti, and you can almost see him grinning unevenly as he admired his unintended craftsmanship. The lane narrows, funneling you toward a small clearing where the air feels heavier, a place where the hedges part reluctantly, as if still wary of visitors, and in the center lies a faint ring of hardened soil, the last imprint of the time Morphin tried to recreate a defensive enchantment he once saw in a book and ended up inventing an entirely new category of magical mishap instead. You stand at the edge of the circle, the energy prickling your ankles like static from an overly enthusiastic carpet, and you sense the struggle Morphin carried within him, an inheritance of pride and instability intertwined so tightly that even his magic couldn't untangle them. Each spell he cast a reflection of the tangled quiet that lived beneath his restless exterior. Another light joke drifts across your mind as you picture a ministry safety inspector arriving here, taking one look at the hedges, the scorch marks, and the lingering magical sparks, and immediately turning in their resignation letter with no forwarding address. The clearing seems to contract around you, not in danger, but in memory, as though the land itself remembers every flick of Morphin's wand, every muttered curse, every restless hour he spent pacing these hedgerows while clinging to the Gaunt name like a badge, even as the world around him shifted, modernized, and quietly left his family behind. You kneel, brushing your fingers across the soil, feeling the faint thrum of old magic seep through your skin like a whispered echo of everything Morphin tried to express but never fully understood. And in that moment, you realize that this clearing holds not just the residue of broken spells, but the imprint of a young man trapped between legacy and limitation. his life spent navigating a maze of expectation, isolation, and inherited instability. The hedgerows sway gently, branches brushing together in a soft rustle, and you feel the clearing releasing its breath around you, a tired exhale from decades of holding memories too heavy for the soil. A final light joke flickers through your thoughts as you imagine Morphin's spells drifting off to find new hobbies, possibly joining a choir of malfunctioning charms somewhere. And as you rise to your feet, the lane seems to brighten slightly, as if acknowledging that the echoes of Morphin's wand, wild, chaotic, and heartbreakingly human, have been seen once more. You return from the hedgerows and approach the Gaunt shack again, but this time you circle to the left where a cracked, dust-fogged window hangs crooked in its frame, the very spot where Merope Gaunt once stood with her thin hands pressed to the sill, staring out at the world with a trembling sort of hope that flickered as faintly as the candle she kept on her nightstand, its light wavering like a tiny rebellion against the gloom that filled the house, a gloom so thick it felt like it had been passed down through generations, the same way other families pass down heirloom quilts or sensible financial advice. The window glass is smudged with decades of grime, but as you lean closer, you can almost see the ghostly outline of her silhouette lingering there, the curve of a girl who longed for tenderness in a place where the walls were more likely to hiss than to listen. And you imagine her watching the lane for the brief moments when Tom Riddle Sr. rode past on his horse, the young Muggle man unaware that each time he trotted by, Merope's heart fluttered with a mixture of yearning and fear, the kind that settles deep enough to become a habit rather than a choice. You feel the hush around this side of the shack, the stillness of a place that remembers a girl who breathed softly to avoid attracting notice, who practiced tiny sparks of magic only when Morphin was asleep and Marvolo was out shouting into the void, and you realize how suffocatingly small her world must have felt. The interior of this home pressing in around her with every passing year, until she believed the Gaunt curse was not just around her but inside her, woven into her bones like an inheritance of shadows. A light joke flickers in your mind as you imagine Merope carefully straightening the one unbroken plate in the house, trying to add dignity to a room that had given up on decor and settled fully into the aesthetic known as haunted cupboard behind a haunted cupboard. And you can almost hear her sigh with a tired amusement at the idea of living somewhere that didn't smell like damp despair and old snake breath. One mainstream historical fact drifts into your thoughts. Early 20th century wizarding social records note that poverty among pureblood families, though uncommon, often produced environments where magical skill deteriorated significantly due to stress, neglect, and lack of formal mentorship, a phenomenon tragically evident in Merope's faltering control over her own magic, which flickered weakly under the oppressive watch of her family. You step closer to the window, the rotting wood frame sagging under your touch, and you sense the fragile thread of hope that must have lived inside Merope, a thread so delicate that even a harsh word could snap it, and you picture her clutching her chest during the nights when the only sound in the shack was her own heartbeat trying to convince her she deserved more than shadows and shards. She must have stood here on countless evenings, watching the horizon glow with sunset, imagining warmth she had never felt and kindness she had only read about in borrowed stories or overheard in the tavern when Marvolo dragged Morphin into town for arguments disguised as errands, and you can almost taste the metallic tang of longing that filled the air around her, a longing so vivid it might as well have been its own form of magic. A fringe tidbit stirs in your memory. The old rural superstition claiming that windows facing west were believed to drain sadness from a household as the sun set, absorbing sorrow like a sponge until the glass grew cold. A belief so obscure that scholars still list it as an open scholarly debate, largely because no one can agree whether the superstition started with wizards or muggles, or with one extremely poetic window salesman. The air here feels thinner, as if the world itself remembers Merope's quiet desperation, and you imagine her eyes following the movements of Tom Riddle Sr. with the soft, aching admiration of someone who had experienced so little affection that even a fleeting smile from a passing stranger could ignite her imagination into a full-blown dreamscape. You picture her clutching her worn dress, smoothing its frayed edges not out of vanity, but out of a wish to feel worthy of being seen, and you sense the weight of her isolation pressing against your ribs. The echo of a girl who wanted nothing more than to step into a life where she wasn't dismissed, silenced, or feared by her own kin. Inside the shack, you see the flicker of that same candle flame swaying in the stale air as though reenacting the countless nights she lay awake, her thoughts swirling with impossible futures and tightly held secrets, and you imagine her tracing invisible patterns in the air, practicing the delicate art of believing in a tomorrow she had never been given permission to hope for. A second light joke drifts into your mind as you consider how the shack itself probably groaned in dramatic protest every time she opened a window, as if offended by the idea of fresh air intruding on its proud legacy of gloom, and you can practically hear the floorboards muttering about how they didn't sign up for renovations, emotional or otherwise. You step back and allow the moment to wash over you, the soft hum of memory vibrating in the air, and you realize that Merope's yearning wasn't foolish or naive. It was courageous in a way that defies logic, her determination to imagine gentleness in a world that had given her nothing but cruelty, a quiet rebellion stronger than any spell she had ever cast. The earth around the window is soft with moss, each tuft a tiny echo of the nights. Merope leaned out to breathe air that wasn't soaked in shouting, hoping the moon might lend her a fragment of serenity she couldn't find inside, and you feel the delicate tremor of her longing settle under your skin like a whisper of a life she dreamed of but rarely believed she could reach. A third light joke rises as you picture her trying to polish the family's one surviving chair, only for the chair to creak back at her in a tone that can only be described as, "Don't waste your time. I gave up centuries ago." And the absurdity of the moment adds a bittersweet charm to the imagined scene. The glimmer of that candle inside the shack draws your eye again, dancing gently like a heartbeat made visible, and you imagine Merope sitting beside it, her shadow trembling on the wall as she practiced tiny, shaky spells meant to bring her a sliver of joy, levitating a fallen petal, warming her chilled fingers, igniting a single spark that reminded her magic still lived somewhere inside her, even if her confidence had withered under years of cruelty. You sense the enormity of her longing, the way it swelled through her chest and pressed against her ribs until her breath hitched, and you imagine her whispering dreams into the night, dreams of a cottage with clean curtains, a table with 2 chairs, and a future where her heart didn't have to hide behind fear and inherited bitterness. The silence around you thickens, not with menace, but with memory, the weight of a girl who stood at this window believing that love could be her escape, that her heart could guide her toward a life her magic alone could not secure. And you feel the ache of her story settle into the grass, the wood, and the air itself. The world around you seems to pause, honoring the fragile hope of the girl who once stood here, and as the last traces of her candle glow fade from your imagination, you realize that this moment, this sliver of gentleness amidst lifetimes of cruelty, was the quiet beginning of a choice that would alter the future of the entire wizarding world. You follow the faint shift in the air around the Gaunt shack, drawn toward the memory of a moment when Merope Gaunt, trembling but determined, stepped into the narrow kitchen, where a chipped cauldron sat waiting like an accomplice with questionable moral boundaries. And as you picture her standing there with sleeves rolled up and eyes shining with a dangerous mixture of fear and longing, you feel the weight of the fateful choice she was about to make settle across your shoulders like a heavy cloak that refuses to sit straight, the kind that slides dramatically to one side as if demanding attention. The cauldron rests on the soot-darkened stove, its rounded shape reflecting the flicker of candlelight in soft, uneven glimmers, and you imagine how Merope's hands must have shaken as she uncorked tiny bottles of ingredients she had gathered quietly, each one chosen with the kind of careful deliberation you'd expect from someone assembling a recipe not for dinner, but for destiny, her breath catching just slightly every time she remembered who she was making it for. A light joke sneaks into your mind as you imagine the cauldron rolling its metaphorical eyes at being asked to participate in yet another questionable love potion scenario. If cauldrons could talk, this one would probably file a report with the Department of Magical Cookware Safety and promptly retire, but it sits loyally, waiting for the drop, stir, and simmer sequence that would forever alter the Gaunt bloodline. The room smells faintly of crushed rose thorns, cinnamon dust, and something sharper, an ingredient so ancient that even modern potion masters argue about its origins. A debate recorded in magical journals as an enduring, open scholarly debate, thanks to a handful of academics who simply refuse to let the argument go, passionately insisting that the difference between essence of moondew and distilled nightshade breath actually matters in the long run. A soft wind rattles the window pane as you picture Merup leaning over the bubbling mixture, her hair falling forward in quiet curls, her face illuminated by the warm glow of potion's flame, as though the universe itself were lighting her from below for dramatic effect. And for a moment you can almost hear her whispering the tiniest incantation, not to enhance the brew but to steady her nerves. A fragile mantra whispered by someone whose life had been devoid of stability, affection, and the kind of gentle reassurance most people take for granted. One mainstream historical fact surfaces. By the early 1900s, the ministry had published strict guidelines on love potion regulation due to misuse among young wizards, a set of laws that clearly did not reach the Gaunt shack, given that Marvolo was far too busy screaming about bloodlines to read pamphlets, and Morphin used official documents mainly as makeshift kindling. The potion turns a warm, luminous gold in your imagination, swirling with hypnotic spirals that rise like delicate ribbons of light, and you sense the aching hope inside Merupe crackle through the air, a fragile spark of belief that this brew could carve her an escape route from the suffocating misery of her home. And you imagine how the room must have seemed brighter in that moment, as though her longing itself illuminated the dust motes drifting slowly around her. A second light joke dances across your thoughts as you picture the potion bubbling with the enthusiasm of a stew that thinks it's auditioning for a role in a dramatic play, one of those overly expressive cauldron productions where every ingredient tries a little too hard to be noticed, but the humor doesn't detract from the underlying ache of Merope's decision. You can almost hear her heartbeat echo in the stillness, a soft rhythm that grows louder each time she glances toward the doorway. Imagining Tom Riddle Sr.'s silhouette framed by sunlight, imagining the way her breath might tremble if he ever actually looked at her with the softness she desperately wished for. And the intensity of that longing fills the room like warm water, rising slowly, inexorably, around your ankles. The potion thickens into a slow, radiant shimmer, and you imagine Merope dipping a silver spoon into it with a hand so unsteady that the spoon taps the edge of the cauldron, the quiet metallic click sounding like a question she refuses to acknowledge as doubt, her chest tightening with the belief that this mixture, this fragile creation, will open a door she could never push open alone. You step back in your mind and see her gather the potion into a tiny glass vial, the cork worn and slightly crooked, and as she wraps it in a scrap of cloth she saved from an old dress, the irony strikes you. A girl who never owned anything precious was about to use the most forbidden kind of magic to try to secure her one precious wish. A fringe tidbit floats through your thoughts, the old countryside belief that potions brewed on nights when the wind shifted from east to west were said to deepen emotional effects, a superstition so obscure that historians still scratch their heads and scribble footnotes about its origins, a topic that continues to earn the label of open scholarly debate, especially since no one agrees whether the wind direction actually mattered or whether it was simply a poetic flourish added by a bored potion instructor centuries ago. The room seems to darken as the candle flame wavers, and you feel the emotional gravity of this moment settle around you, the kind of gravity that stretches forward through time, shaping every future step of Merope's short life and echoing across generations until it reaches the boy she would one day carry, a child who inherited both her longing and her sorrow in ways neither she nor the world could ever foresee. A third light joke drifts softly across your thoughts as you imagine the potion giving off a tiny sparkle, as if proudly announcing, "Yes, I am absolutely meddlesome." But beneath the humor lies a deeper truth. This moment wasn't whimsical or mischievous. It was a desperate attempt by a girl who had never been given the tools to believe in herself, using the only magic she thought she had enough power to control. You picture her clutching the vial to her chest, her breath trembling as she imagined giving it to Tom Riddle Sr., her mind racing not with triumph but with the fragile, wavering hope that for once in her life something might go right, that she might be seen not as a descendant of a cursed bloodline, but as a girl deserving of kindness and companionship. The air in the room feels thick with her hopes, her fears, her trembling resolve, and as she steps out into the night, alone but determined, the shack behind her seems to sigh, as though even the sagging walls understood that this step, this decision, carried enough weight to change the fate of the wizarding world forever. The last flicker of candlelight glows against the glass vial in her hand, casting a soft golden shimmer that reflects the fragile bravery within her. And as you watch her disappear into the darkened lane where her future waits, you understand that the love potion wasn't merely a brew, but a symbol of her belief in a life she had been taught she could never have. A belief so profound it echoed across generations, binding herself, her child, and the world to the consequences of a single moment born from yearning, loneliness, and the tiniest spark of hope. You follow the invisible thread of Merope's choice into the small, dim corners of a life that shifted almost overnight, as though the world itself inhaled sharply the moment she handed Tom Riddle Sr. that shimmering vial. And now you find yourself standing at the edge of a memory woven from equal parts longing, illusion, and the soft, fragile hope of a girl who wanted nothing more than to build a life of gentleness after years spent suffocating under the heavy shadows of the Gaunt name. The village road under your feet feels smoother here, worn by the passage of horses and wheels, and you picture Merope walking beside Tom as if the world had finally granted her permission to exist in daylight, her shoulders lifting slightly as she stepped away from the oppressive weight of her family's shack, her dress brushing softly against her ankles with every tentative stride toward a life she could scarcely believe she was living. The air holds the faint scent of damp earth and freshly turned soil, the kind that clings to memory, and you imagine Tom looking at her with eyes softened by the potion's influence, his voice warm in ways it had never been before, his gestures gentle, even affectionate, and for a brief, shimmering moment, Merope might have felt as though the universe had cracked open to let her through. You imagine her hands trembling, not from fear, but from wonder, as she smoothed her hair in the reflection of a window, seeing not the neglected girl from the Gaunt shack, but someone who could walk beside a man she adored without shrinking under the weight of her bloodline. And you sense the quiet triumph that filled her chest with each passing day, a triumph so rare it glowed like a candle sheltered from the wind. A light joke rises softly in your thoughts as you picture the neighbors whispering about Tom Riddle's sudden romantic transformation, their confused expressions resembling owls trying to solve crosswords. But beneath the humor lies a deeper ache, because you know, even as you walk through this memory, that the life Merope built existed on borrowed magic, borrowed hope, borrowed time. A mainstream historical fact flickers at the edge of your mind. In early 20th century Britain, cases of magically influenced relationships were recorded more frequently than later eras, leading to widespread arguments within the ministry about ethics, consent, and the long-term effects of enchantments on emotional well-being, debates that still fill brittle parchment files in the Department of Magical Law Enforcement. You picture Merope sitting at a small kitchen table in the modest home she and Tom shared for a short time, the sunlight warming her cheeks as she traced circles on the wood grain, imagining the kind of future she had never dared to dream in the Gaunt shack, curtains of her choosing, meals not eaten in fear, laughter that didn't echo against broken walls, and a child who might grow up free from the choking grip of ancestral bitterness. The air around her seems gentler here, carrying the soft rhythm of domestic routines she never knew, and you see her smiling as she learned to stir soup without burning it, humming quietly as if she were trying to fill the silent spaces in her heart with music instead of dread. A second light joke flits across your thoughts as you imagine Tom trying to fix a squeaky cabinet and making it worse, prompting Merope to hide her laughter behind her hand in a moment so small and tender it feels like the kind of scene she once believed would only ever exist in other people's lives. Yet while the world around her grew warmer, her magic, long suppressed by years of trauma, began to flicker with new strength, glowing faintly in the corners of her mind, the way a thawing river begins to move again beneath melting ice. And one evening, as she held her hand over her stomach, she realized she was carrying the new arc of her bloodline within her, a child who would one day be known by a name whispered in fear, awe, and legend. A fringe tidbit drifts into your thoughts. Rural magical midwives once claimed that unborn children responded to the emotional experiences of their mothers, their early moods shaping the magical resonance around them, a belief so old and contradictory that scholars still classify it as an open scholarly debate, citing inconsistent records and a shortage of controlled studies on fetal magic, though one particularly passionate expert once described it as theoretical emotional alchemy. The memory deepens as you imagine Merope gently pressing her fingertips against her belly, whispering soft words into the quiet room, her voice trembling not with fear, but with the fragile hope that her child might inherit a future brighter than her past, a future shaped not by curses, coldness, or rage, but by the softness she had begun to believe she deserved. You see her leaning against the doorframe, watching Tom with eyes full of warmth so real it could almost overpower the knowledge of the truth, that the love binding them was not entirely his own, that the potion shimmered invisibly between their hearts. A third light joke sparks faintly as you imagine Tom puzzling over why he suddenly felt compelled to bring home flowers, his internal monologue probably sounding like a wand safety manual read at double speed. But the humor fades as the moment grows heavier because you know what is coming. The moment when Merope, brave in a way only the deeply broken can be, decided to stop giving Tom the potion. You imagine her waking in the early dawn, her fingers trembling as she held the vial, the gold liquid glowing faintly in the half-light, and you sense the storm of emotions swirling inside her, hope, fear, longing, and the desperate desire to know whether the gentleness she had tasted could survive without magic, whether the man she loved could love her of his own accord. The day she chose to stop the potion must have felt like standing on the edge of a cliff with her heart in her hands, the world holding its breath as she stepped into the unknown. Time shifts in the memory, and you see her at the cottage window months later, her belly rounded with the child she carried, Tom long gone, the house silent except for the soft echo of the life growing inside her. Her eyes gaze toward the horizon with a depth of sorrow so profound it settles into the dust motes floating in the air, and you feel the ache of loss ripple through the room like a cold wind, lifting the threads of her remaining strength. The world around her shrinks, yet within her grows the final, echoing legacy of a bloodline shaped by sorrow, survival, and the fragile hope that refused to die until the very moment she could hold her child. The candle beside her flickers one last time, its flame bending toward her as if trying to offer comfort, and you understand that in stepping away from magic, she made her final wish not for herself, but for the baby she would soon bring into a world that would remember his name long after hers faded into quiet, tragic history. You follow the fading echo of Merope's last days into the quiet corridors of memory, where a small orphanage stands weathered beneath a gray London sky, its bricks damp with decades of rain and its windows dull with the residue of too many forgotten nights. And as you imagine the moment the infant Tom Riddle was carried inside, wrapped in a thin blanket and bearing a name that would one day send shivers through the world, you feel the weight of silence settle over the scene like dust gathering on an unopened letter, the kind that waits patiently for someone to read it but knows deep down that no one ever will. The matron who lifted him into her arms did so with the tired competence of someone who had seen too many abandoned children and not enough happily ever afters, and she likely noticed nothing unusual about him except the unsettling stillness in his newborn eyes, a quiet alertness that flickered even in those first hours, as though he were listening not to the world around him, but to some deeper resonance beneath it. The corridor smells faintly of starch, damp wool, and boiled cabbage, the universal fragrance of underfunded institutions. Yet beneath the dull familiarity of it lies a pulsing thread of magic so faint it seems ashamed to exist, the inherited spark of the Gaunt bloodline clinging to the child like a shadow too young to understand its own shape. A light joke hovers at the edge of your thoughts as you picture the other children reacting to Tom's uncanny stillness, perhaps assuming he came pre-installed with some sort of brooding mode. But the humor softens quickly as you sense the loneliness that wrapped around him from the moment he entered this place. Loneliness not born from neglect, but from a fundamental disconnect between his inner world and the one he had been thrust into. A mainstream historical fact surfaces. Orphanages in early 20th century Britain were notoriously overcrowded and under-resourced, a result of widespread poverty, illness, and the lingering economic instability of the era, conditions that fostered environments where children grew up quickly, hardened even faster, and rarely found the consistent emotional support they needed to thrive. You can almost see young Tom sitting apart from the others in the common room, his small hands clasped neatly in his lap, eyes following the subtle currents of human behavior with the unflinching focus of someone who believed observation was safer than participation. And you sense that even then he understood, instinctively, that belonging was a luxury he would not be afforded. A fringe tidbit drifts into your mind. A handful of magical theorists once suggested that latent magical children often display early signs of heightened perception, noticing emotional undercurrents or atmospheric shifts that non-magical peers cannot detect, a notion that has remained an open scholarly debate for generations, largely because no one can agree whether these observations reflect innate magical sensitivity or the simple hyper-awareness born from childhood hardship. The memory deepens as you imagine Tom's early years unfolding like a series of quiet, deliberate steps through a world that rarely made room for him. And you see him learning to speak in precise, measured tones, to walk with a composed stillness that unsettled adults without them understanding why, and to smile only when he wished to create an effect, a tool rather than a reflex. His childhood bed sits small and narrow against a cracked plaster wall, the blanket thin and scratchy, and you picture him lying awake long after the other children have fallen asleep, his mind weaving patterns from the flicker of street lamps outside, his breath steady, his thoughts sharp, his magic humming beneath his ribs like a faintly beating drum, waiting for the moment it would be allowed to sound. A second light joke flickers through your imagination as you picture the matron trying to scold him for something trivial, only to find herself unnerved by his unwavering stare, perhaps wondering privately if she was developing a sudden and inexplicable fear of well-behaved children. But the humor fades as the scene shifts to the small courtyard where Tom played alone. You see him turning over stones with careful fingers, examining insects, watching the wind twist fallen leaves into brief spirals, all with the intense concentration of someone who sensed, deeply, that the world held secrets he was meant to uncover. And then you imagine the first time he used magic intentionally, even if he didn't realize it was intentional. Perhaps a bully who tormented him found himself inexplicably dangling from the rafters, or a treasured possession returned to Tom's hand without anyone seeing it move, or a door locked behind him when he wished fiercely to be left alone. The small manifestations of power erupting not from malice, but from the quiet certainty that the world should not get to decide everything for him. A third light joke bubbles faintly as you picture the matron writing yet another incident report labeled "strange behavior, likely imagination," a phrase that probably appeared so often in her notes. She could have used it as a stamp, but beneath the amusement lies a growing sense of inevitability, because each incident was a breadcrumb leading Tom down a path carved long before he was born, shaped by ancestors who whispered through his blood whether he wanted them to or not. The years pass in this memory like pages turning silently, and you see Tom growing taller, sharper, quieter, his posture straightening, his gaze sharpening, his presence deepening into something unmistakable even before he understood what he was becoming. Other children avoided him not because he was unkind, but because his stillness unsettled them. because his eyes saw too much, because he carried the weight of a legacy no one else could sense. The orphanage halls seemed to warp around his presence, bending subtly to accommodate the strange gravity he radiated, the kind of gravity that makes people step aside without knowing why, that silences conversations when he enters a room, that wraps him in an aura of solitary destiny. One evening, you imagine him sitting at the foot of his bed, a small box in his hands containing the few objects he claimed over the years. A stolen button, a found coin, a faded scrap of ribbon, all arranged with care. Not because they were precious, but because they represented small acts of control in a life where so much had been taken from him. You sense the silence around him deepening, heavy not with sadness, but with purpose. The quiet before the spark ignites. And then the memory shifts to a moment in the matron's office. The day a tall, bearded man with half-moon glasses and kind eyes came to see him. A man who would change the trajectory of his life with a single sentence. "You are a wizard." The words echoed through the room like a bell, and though you cannot see Tom's face clearly, you sense the sharp, electric thrill that raced through him, not of joy, but of recognition, as though the universe had finally spoken aloud, a truth he had always felt pulsing beneath his skin. The orphanage around you dims, the walls softening into shadow, and you feel the ripple of magic that unfurled in that moment expand outward through time, shaping the boy who would leave the orphanage not merely with the promise of a new life, but with the knowledge that his power was real, that his instincts had been right, that he was not ordinary, and that he never had been. As the last glimmers of the memory fade, you understand that Tom Riddle grew not from a place of chaos, but from a silence so deep it became a foundation, a silence shaped by absence, sharpened by observation, and transformed by the first flicker of recognition he ever received. And within that silence, inherited from centuries of Gaunt isolation and sorrow, lay the seed of the ambition that would one day reshape the entire wizarding world. You follow the faint tremor of young Tom Riddle's awakening power as it stretches outward from the orphanage into the wider world, where each new discovery sharpens him like a blade drawn slowly, deliberately, across a whetstone, and you find yourself walking through the faint outlines of the places he explored long before anyone realized the depth of the storm gathering behind his quiet, controlled exterior. The storm seeded not from malice, but from the deep, unyielding certainty that he alone must carve the shape of his destiny. The streets of London around you hum with the muted noise of early 20th century life, clattering wheels, distant shouts, the dull roar of industry. But Tom moves through it all with a stillness that seems almost unnatural for a boy his age, his steps measured, his gaze steady, his presence gliding through the world with the eerie calm of someone who learned very young that emotions were luxuries to be folded away like fine linens he never owned. You imagine him wandering into secondhand shops with shelves crowded by forgotten trinkets, his slender fingers trailing over tarnished objects as though he can hear the faint pulse of history inside each one, instinctively drawn to things that carry whispers of stories, power, or suffering. Anything that confirms his long-held belief that the world contains deeper layers hidden from ordinary eyes. A light joke flickers through your thoughts as you picture the bewildered shopkeepers wondering why this unnervingly polite child keeps staring at their old silverware like he's evaluating it for admission into a secret society. But beneath the humor lies the unmistakable truth that Tom's fascination with hidden significance was already taking root, entwining itself around his mind like a vine seeking structure to climb. A mainstream historical fact drifts into place. During the interwar years, London was filled with curio stalls and pawn shops where magical items occasionally slipped into Muggle circulation unnoticed, a reality that created enough ministry panic to justify entire departments dedicated to retrieval, though they rarely caught the pieces that mattered most, the pieces that found their way into the hands of children curious enough and clever enough to sense their dormant importance. You see Tom pausing before an old cracked mirror in one such shop, not because he is vain, but because he is studying himself with the detached fascination of a scientist observing a strange specimen, his dark eyes reflecting not boyish insecurity, but the first glimmers of ambition, the early shape of a belief that he is destined for something grander than the narrow, dusty walls of the orphanage that once held him. As the memory deepens, you watch his world expand further when he receives his Hogwarts letter, the parchment crisp and formal, the ink curling elegantly, like an invitation written by fate itself. And though his face remains still as the matron reads it aloud, you imagine the electric thrill racing beneath his skin, the sense of belonging finally snapping into place as if the universe had handed him a key he had always known existed. A fringe tidbit rises in your mind. Some magical theorists once proposed that the Sorting Hat's more challenging decisions often involve children with powerful latent magic, whose early emotional environments drastically shaped their personalities, a hypothesis that remains an open scholarly debate, primarily because no one can agree whether the hat reads the heart, the mind, or the potential patterns of a life not yet lived. You follow Tom into Hogwarts, the towering castle unfolding around him like the first true home he has ever stepped into, its enchanted ceilings, shifting staircases, and ancient stone corridors resonating with a kind of magic that feels like recognition, like welcome, like the quiet whisper of a place saying, "Yes, you belong here." And yet, even here, he walks slightly apart from the others, observing them with the same cool attentiveness he carried in the orphanage, measuring their habits, cataloging their strengths, cataloging their weaknesses, his control tightening not out of cruelty, but from a lifelong instinct to guard his inner world as fiercely as a dragon guards its hoard. A second light joke slips into your thoughts as you imagine one of his classmates attempting small talk only to be met with Tom's perfectly polite but utterly unreadable stare, sending the poor child scurrying away wondering if they'd accidentally broken some ancient social code. But beneath the small humor lies the growing realization that this distance, this self-containment, is not arrogance, it is armor. You see him excelling in classes with unnerving ease, his wand movements precise, his incantations crisp, his concentration taut as a bowstring, and you sense that the teachers watch him with a mixture of admiration and the faint, prickling discomfort of not knowing exactly what lies beneath his calm exterior. In the dim corridors near the castle's foundations, where few students wander and the air hums with centuries of forgotten enchantments, you picture Tom running his fingers lightly along the stone walls, pausing when he feels the subtle vibration of a serpentine carving half hidden in shadow, a symbol so ancient it seems almost alive beneath the dust, and you imagine his breath slowing as his mind sharpens, his instincts aligning with a truth he has sensed since childhood. That his identity is not an accident, that his lineage is a thread connected to something vast, old, and powerful. His discovery of Parseltongue comes not as a shock, but as a confirmation, a revelation that slots into his understanding of himself, like the final piece of a puzzle he did not know he was assembling, and you feel the world tilt around him as he whispers to the snake in the cupboard, his voice soft and steady, his eyes widening not with fear but with recognition, as though he has finally heard his native tongue for the first time. A third light joke drifts quietly into your mind as you picture his classmates screaming when the snake slithers past them while Tom watches with the expression of someone who has just found a long-lost family member. But the humor fades quickly as you follow him deeper into the castle's secrets, to the moments when he began connecting the ancient Slytherin myths to the strange resonance he felt in certain corridors, particularly those near the girls' bathroom on the second floor where the air carries a damp, echoing quiet that feels like an invitation written in silence. The castle seems to respond to him, its shadows stretching deeper, its magic humming a little louder, and you sense the Gaunt inheritance awakening inside him, not as a curse but as a compass directing him toward the Chamber of Secrets long before he even understands its full significance. You imagine him studying genealogy in the library late at night, tracing names, lines, and symbols with fingers that tremble, not from fear but from the weight of discovery, each page drawing him closer to the truth of his ancestry, the truth of his purpose, the truth that he is not merely Tom Riddle of Wool's orphanage, but Tom Riddle of the Gaunt bloodline, heir of a legacy steeped in shadows and serpents. The knowledge does not frighten him, it steadies him, anchors him, shapes him, and as he walks the corridors with newfound certainty, You see how his presence sharpens, how his footsteps quiet, how the air bends ever so slightly when he passes, the castle itself recognizing his lineage with an ancient whisper. And as the memory settles, you see him standing alone in the darkened chamber beneath the school, the basilisk's scales shimmering faintly in the shadows as he gazes into the dim, cavernous expanse, with the expression of someone who has finally found the missing half of his own heartbeat, understanding at last that his past, his magic, and his destiny are bound to the same serpentine thread. The chamber air cools around him, the echoes deepening, and you understand that in this moment, the Gaunt curse transforms into something sharper, something driven, something unyielding, a force shaped not by pain alone but by ambition carved from silence, loneliness, and the ancient magic that throbbed quietly in his blood since the day he was born. You follow the deepening pulse of Tom Riddle's ambition as it rises from the dim chambers beneath Hogwarts and unfurls into the wide, shifting fabric of the wizarding world, a quiet, deliberate force shaped by years of silence, observation, and the relentless belief that destiny was not something inherited, but something carved, layer by meticulous layer, into the bones of time itself. The chamber's darkness fades as you imagine him returning to the surface with the steady stride of someone who has finally located the core of his identity, the echo of serpentine whispers still coiled beneath his skin, guiding him with a certainty that grows sharper each time he moves through the corridors of the ancient castle that now feels less like a school and more like an extension of his own mind. The air around him seems to hum with awareness, subtle shifts in candlelight, faint tremors in the stone, the soft rustle of tapestries reacting as he passes, and though the students around him notice none of it, he feels each response as though the castle itself were a living monument acknowledging the bloodline that once shaped it, a lineage that now breathes through him. In the library's shadowed alcoves, he reads with a hunger that goes beyond curiosity, turning pages of brittle parchment that whisper of ancient rituals, lost branches of magical theory, and obscure histories so tangled in myth that even the most respected scholars dismiss them as unprovable, though you can almost feel Tom's quiet amusement at how easily scholars give up when confronted with the unknown. A light joke flickers at the edge of your thoughts as you picture Madame Pince glaring at him with the same suspicion she normally reserves for students who dog-ear pages, her instincts pricked by the unnerving stillness with which he reads, the slight tilt of his head suggesting he is not just absorbing the information, but evaluating it for potential uses she would never approve of. Yet, the humor softens into a growing solemnity as you watch Tom's interest shift from history to theory, then from theory to practice, and finally from practice to possibility, his ambition widening like the aperture of a camera adjusting for deeper focus. A mainstream historical fact grounds the scene. By the mid-20th century, debates over magical immortality, particularly Horcruxes, were largely theoretical within academic circles, discussed only in the driest of tones and with layers of ethical disclaimers that made students' eyes glaze over during advanced seminars. But Tom read these discussions not as warnings, but as invitations, his mind threading possibilities through the gaps where scholars had left cautious silences. You imagine him late at night in the Slytherin common room, the greenish light flickering across his features as he stares into the fire with an expression too calm, too deliberate for his age, his thoughts turning like gears inside a clock whose ticking only he can hear. The fringe tidbit that surfaces next feels inevitable. Certain magical theorists once argued that the emotional resonance of ancient bloodlines, particularly those tied to founders, clans, and cursed families, could influence the arc of a wizard's potential. A theory dismissed so often that it lives permanently in the open scholarly debate section of magical academia. Yet as you look at Tom moving through the corridors, running his fingers along stone grooves shaped 8 centuries earlier, you feel the truth ripple through the air. The Gaunt bloodline was not just history, it was a gravitational field, and he had stepped directly into its center. As Tom grows older, the world around him shifts like a series of doors unlocking. You imagine Dumbledore watching him with that peculiar mix of fascination and concern, sensing the sharpness beneath Tom's polished charm but unable to fully predict the direction that sharpness would take. And you picture teachers praising him for his extraordinary skill, unaware that each compliment lands not as encouragement, but as confirmation of what Tom already believes, that he stands apart, above, beyond. A second light joke rises as you imagine Professor Slughorn enthusiastically clasping Tom's shoulder during one of his infamous hand-picked dinners, completely oblivious that the boy he is grooming for prestige is quietly studying him in return, filing away every detail with the precision of a historian annotating a crucial text. But as Tom leaves Hogwarts and steps into adulthood, the world opens even further. London is a palette of fog and opportunity, and you picture him moving through streets lined with war-era tension, his presence slipping through crowds with the fluidity of a whisper. The ministry doors glide open for him, but he does not enter as an apprentice with earnest curiosity. He enters as a strategist, a collector of information, a young man whose charm, poise, and intelligence create an effortless aura of promise that hides the deeper currents shaping every choice he makes. He studies people as carefully as he once studied ancient runes, observing their habits, vulnerabilities, and ambitions. His voice warm when needed, cold when necessary, and always, always steady. The Gaunt shack still lingers at the edge of his memory, not as a source of shame, but as a reminder of the power he refuses to relinquish to fate. You can almost feel him carrying Merup's legacy, the silence, the longing, the sorrow, as a polished stone in his pocket, its edges smoothed not by healing, but by discipline, control, and the relentless drive to shape his identity through action rather than inheritance. In this memory, you walk with him into the old forests near Little Hangleton, the same woods where Marvolo once shouted into the shadows, and Morphin once carved scorch marks into the hedgerows. And though the air still hums with the residue of past tempers, Tom stands among the trees with a quiet, contemplative stillness that feels almost ceremonial. He studies the shack with a detached gaze, his expression unreadable as he steps inside for the last time, moving through the decayed remains of the life he never knew. A cracked ring box, a broken chair, a dusty carving half lost beneath debris. No visible emotion crosses his face, but you sense the shift inside him, a quiet acknowledgement of the legacy that shaped him before he ever drew breath, and then a calm, deliberate rejection as he leaves the shack behind without looking back. A third light joke flickers briefly as you imagine the shack itself groaning in theatrical indignation, as though offended that the last Gaunt to enter refuses to participate in its customary atmosphere of gloom. But the humor fades into a deeper silence as Tom returns to the world with a new, sharper clarity. His path from that moment forward becomes one of careful construction, gathering followers not through fear but through fascination, extending tendrils of influence through charisma before ever revealing the steel beneath it, and crafting a persona that grows slowly, deliberately, like a shadow stretching across stone as the sun dips lower. And yet, beneath all his choices, beneath the layers of ambition and discipline, beneath the charm and the precision, pulses the echo of a bloodline twisted through centuries of isolation, sorrow, and unresolved longing. The Gaunt curse has not vanished. It has transformed, woven itself into Tom's identity, not as a chain, but as propulsion, driving him toward a destiny shaped not by doom, but by determination. You see him standing once more beneath the vaulted ceiling of the Chamber of Secrets, his silhouette framed by the serpentine columns, and the air around him vibrates with the ancient echoes of Slytherin himself, the founder's legacy thrumming in resonance with the boy who has now stepped fully into the role his bloodline carved for him. And though the basilisk sleeps in the shadows, its presence coils through the chamber like a silent promise, a symbol of the deep magic that ties Tom not just to his ancestry, but to the world he intends to reshape. As the chamber fades from your imagination and the world around you softens, you understand that this is not the end of the Gaunt bloodline story, but the threshold of its most formidable chapter, the point where sorrow becomes strategy, where silence becomes power, and where the cursed bloodline, far from ending, transforms into a force that will ripple through history long after the shack has decayed into dust, and the last of the hedgerows have grown over the footprints of Tom Riddle's childhood. And this is where the next chapter begins. 2 more sections remain, 11 and 12, and your journey will close exactly there, as requested. You follow the widening arc of Tom Riddle's rise as it unfurls through the shifting decades, each year adding new layers to the presence he carries, smooth, polished, and quiet on the surface, yet coiled with purpose beneath, the kind of purpose that moves without haste, because it has already chosen its destination long before the path becomes visible to others. The wizarding world in these years is alive with tension and transition, a landscape caught between the remnants of old aristocratic families and the fast modernizing structures of post-war society, and Tom walks through it with a poise so unnervingly precise that even seasoned ministry officials step aside without realizing why, sensing in him that rare combination of refinement and unreadability that marks someone destined to shape history rather than merely inhabit it. He cultivates his influence the way a master gardener tends a rare serpent vine, coaxing it upward with gentle gestures while quietly winding it around the trellises of power, earning trust with smiles that never quite reach his eyes, and collecting knowledge with methodical patience, never revealing how each scrap fits into the architecture forming inside his mind. You imagine him moving among the shelves of Borgin and Burke's, the dim shop humming with the faint residue of old curses and forgotten histories, and you picture the way he handles each artifact with a reverence bordering on hunger, his fingertips brushing against objects that whisper of darker potentials, his gaze steady as he studies the rippling interplay of fear, fascination, and secrecy that flows through the customers he serves. A light joke flickers into your mind as you picture Borgin nervously wringing his hands behind the counter each time Tom smiles politely, as if suspecting that the young man's manners are so perfect they must be hiding at least 3 layers of subtext. But even the faint humor cannot soften the gravity of the years unfolding here, years in which Tom refines himself with such meticulous control that his public persona takes on the sheen of elegance, intelligence, and ambition wrapped in velvet, while the deeper truth coils beneath like a serpent hidden in tall grass. A mainstream historical fact grounds the moment. During the 1940s and 1950s, the wizarding world underwent significant shifts in governance, magical law, and the regulation of dangerous artifacts, creating pockets of vulnerability within old legal structures. Pockets Tom exploits without hesitation, slipping through bureaucratic gaps with the subtlety of smoke drifting through keyholes as he continues to track the artifacts connected to his lineage, to Hogwarts, and to the shadows of immortality. You picture him in dim storerooms late at night, the only illumination a single floating orb of light hovering at his shoulder, his face drawn into stillness as he opens old boxes containing rings, daggers, faded journal pages, and ancient fragments of bone, each item examined not with the curiosity of a collector, but with the precision of a sculptor, visualizing the final form long before the marble yields to the chisel. A fringe tidbit rises from the depths of magical scholarship. Scattered historical notes suggest that certain cursed bloodlines, especially those entwined with founders or dark witches, exhibit resonance with specific artifacts, a claim so nebulous and inconsistent that academics label it an open scholarly debate. But as you watch Tom lift Marvolo's ring for the first time, holding it between his fingers like a relic of both ancestry and opportunity, you feel a pulse in the air, an echo of recognition crossing centuries to settle in the hand of the boy who once stood unnoticed in an orphanage courtyard. He studies the stone set into the gaunt ring, his expression calm but sharpened by the subtle widening of his pupils, and though no words pass his lips, you sense the silent conclusion forming in his mind, that the Gaunts did not merely leave him a legacy, they left him a blueprint. You follow him into years of quiet experimentation, hours spent refining increasingly complex spells in abandoned rooms, forgotten tunnels, and places so old their enchantments have grown faint around the edges. His movements are precise, his breath steady, his wand steady, each gesture a thread pulled through the fabric of possibility. You imagine him reciting incantations so softly the words sound like breath dissolving in cold air, runes glowing faintly on the floor beneath his feet, the atmosphere around him thickening with the weight of decisions made with full clarity, devoid of hesitation, devoid of remorse. Another light joke drifts into your thoughts as you picture a ministry clerk misplacing yet another file labeled "Unusual Magical Phenomena," unresolved, likely involving one of Tom's early experiments, and imagining the clerk muttering that the castle ghosts must be pranking them again. But beneath the humor lies the deeper truth. Tom's work is invisible not because he hides it clumsily, but because he designs his life so that nothing leaves a trace unless he intends it to. As years pass, he begins to gather others, not yet followers, but orbiting minds drawn to his intelligence, charisma, and elegance of speech. You imagine Slughorn's dinner parties, the soft clink of cutlery, the amber glow of lanterns, Tom leaning forward at just the right moments, asking questions with feigned innocence, weaving threads of fascination while keeping his own thoughts tightly concealed behind a polished veneer. He does not manipulate with blunt force. He cultivates, guiding with courtesy, with flattery, with the gentle nudge of suggestion, so subtle that even the most cunning among them mistake his influence for their own idea. And yet, beneath this social grace lies the deeper current, the one shaped by the Gaunt lineage, the one forged in the quiet years of the orphanage, the one refined in the echoing chambers beneath Hogwarts. That current pulls him back to the forest, back to the shack, back to the places where his bloodline first broke and reshaped itself. You picture him returning to Little Hangleton in the dead of night, the moon cold and bright overhead, the village silent as he walks the narrow lanes with a deliberate ease that chills the air around him. The shack stands unchanged, slumped and broken like a memory refusing to dissolve, and Tom steps inside with a calm so absolute it feels like ritual. In the center of the ruined room he pauses, the faint scent of must and old dust rising around him, and without a flicker of hesitation he lifts his wand. No emotion crosses his face as he studies the carving on the wall, the old grooves left by Morphin's restless wand all those years ago. The air seems to tremble, the walls creaking as though recognizing the last of the Gaunts has returned not as a frightened child or a curious boy, but as the culmination of everything the bloodline has carried for centuries. You sense the shift inside Tom, small, precise, irreversible, as he lifts Marvolo's ring to his lips and whispers a spell so quiet it barely stirs the dust. When the magic pulses outward, faint and cold, the shack groans, not in fear, but in recognition. A second light joke flickers at the edges of your thoughts as you imagine a passerby glancing toward the shack and thinking the wind must be particularly dramatic tonight. But the moment holds no real humor. Not here, not now, not at the threshold of transformation. Tom's silhouette stands tall against the rotting beams, his presence filling the space that once crushed Merope's hope, once echoed with Marvolo's rage, once trembled beneath Morphin's frantic spells, and in that instant he becomes not the last Gaunt, but the rewriting of the Gaunts, a rebirth sharpened by ambition rather than sorrow. You follow him as he leaves the shack behind for the final time, his footsteps light, his expression calm, his future unfolding before him with the precision of architecture he has already drawn in his mind. The world that once ignored him will soon feel the echo of his presence in every corner, through alliances that bend to charisma, through secrets carved into artifacts, through whispers that cling to corridors where he walks. The transformation is slow and deliberate, a patient accumulation of influence, knowledge, and power, each step leaving no trace except the quiet tightening of destiny. A third light joke emerges softly as you picture the Daily Prophet eventually running headlines attempting to summarize Tom Riddle's rise with overly dramatic fonts and unnecessary punctuation. But beneath the humor, the truth remains steady. Tom's ascent is not sudden. It is not chaotic. It is not loud. It is the inevitable convergence of bloodline, intelligence, hunger, discipline, and the quiet conviction that he was meant not merely to exist but to reshape the world. As the years stretch ahead, You sense the wizarding world tilting ever so slightly, as though gravity has shifted around a point no one else has identified. And Tom stands at the center of it, calm, unhurried, and entirely certain of the shape his future will take. The Gaunt curse no longer clings to him as decay or misfortune. It has become fuel, the smoldering ember that drives each step he takes toward the destiny he builds with his own hands. And as the memory softens, you understand that the story of the cursed bloodline has reached the edge of its transformation. One last descent remains, Section 12, where all threads will quiet, all echoes will fade, all shadows will settle, and the journey will close in the gentle stillness you requested. You follow the final arc of the Gaunt bloodline's shadowed journey as it stretches toward its quiet, inevitable conclusion. Not in a thunderclap, not in a blaze of curses, but in the slow, heavy settling of history as it folds itself into place, each layer softening into the next until only echoes remain, drifting through the corridors of memory like dust caught in lantern light. The wizarding world grows broader as Tom Riddle becomes a man whose name slips through conversations with the smooth precision of a whispered rumor, a presence refined into elegance and poise, his footsteps measured, his voice calm, his intentions hidden so deeply beneath charm and intellect that even those who pride themselves on perceptiveness fail to see the deeper architecture behind his every movement. You imagine him walking through Diagon Alley on a muted afternoon, the flags above the shops fluttering in cool wind, his cloak swaying softly with each step, and though people smile politely at him, offering greetings dipped in warmth or admiration, he responds with the same gentle courtesy that veils the quiet, coiled purpose living inside him, like a serpent waiting in tall grass for the moment it decides to move. The years ahead carry him into rooms draped with velvet and polished wood, ministry halls where portraits watch silently from gilded frames, and quiet parlors where influential witches and wizards gather to discuss politics, lineage, and futures they believe they understand, unaware that Tom is using these spaces not to blend in, but to map the weaknesses in their assumptions. You picture him seated at a long table, hands folded neatly, eyes attentive, sensing conversations the way a well-trained musician senses shifts in rhythm, noting who commands the room, who hesitates when they speak, who seeks approval, who hides insecurity behind laughter, and who clings to their family name as though it were a shield forged from centuries of pride. A light joke flickers in your mind as you imagine one such aristocrat bragging about his impeccable ancestry, his voice as pompous as a bewitched teapot giving a lecture, while Tom nods politely with the mild amusement of someone who actually knows what it means to carry the weight of an old bloodline. A mainstream historical fact threads into the moment. By the mid-20th century, debates surrounding pureblood ideology and magical class distinctions were resurging across Europe, fueled by wartime anxiety and generational rifts, creating fertile ground for charismatic figures to reshape public discourse under the guise of tradition or renewal. Tom moves through these shifting currents with the ease of someone who understands the rhythm of change long before others hear its first note. And you see him gradually weaving himself into these conversations, not asserting opinions, but asking questions with such careful neutrality that they linger in the minds of others long after the evening ends. Yet beneath this social refinement lies the deeper current of his legacy, the Gaunt silence, the Gaunt shadows, the Gaunt hunger, not for violence, but for definition, for self-creation, for escape from the fragile humanity he believes holds him back. You follow him into old libraries where he traces his own name on parchment as though testing how it fits beside the names of ancient ancestors. You follow him into forests where he stands beneath branches that remember the temper of Marvolo and the restlessness of Morphin, the cold wind brushing his cloak as though acknowledging the blood connection. You follow him into abandoned ruins where he studies the residue of old magic, feeling it resonate faintly against the steady hum within his own chest. A fringe tidbit stirs at the edge of your thoughts. Some historians have claimed that bloodlines influenced by ancient curses often produce descendants who embody their family's unresolved patterns, rage, sorrow, isolation, ambition. Though the matter remains classified as an open scholarly debate, mostly because scholars cannot agree whether the bloodline shapes the person or the person reshapes the meaning of the bloodline. You feel that tension around Tom now, the quiet pull between inheritance and choice, between the life he was born into and the life he is forging with deliberate, quiet strokes. The memory shifts toward the later years of Tom's young adulthood, when he begins to slip through the wizarding world like a feather carried on a breeze, light, delicate, graceful, but always drifting, always observing, always calculating. You see him entering Hogwarts once more, not as a student, but as a visitor, his face serene as he walks through the halls with steps that echo faintly against centuries of stone. Students whisper his name with admiration, their voices carrying tones of wonder usually reserved for Quidditch stars or famous aurors. Yet Tom moves among them with a detachment so subtle it feels like a thin sheet of glass rests between him and the rest of the world. A second light joke slips into your thoughts as you imagine Peeves attempting to pelt Tom with chalk, only to find himself inexplicably reconsidering his priorities and drifting away instead, mumbling something about bad vibes. But the humor softens quickly as you follow Tom deeper into the castle, to the room where he once learned the history of Hogwarts founders, his gaze lingering on Slytherin's image, not with worship, but with recognition. A recognition born from ancestry, from instinct, from the serpentine pull of the language that flowed through him long before he understood that speaking to snakes was not normal. Time folds quietly as Tom's experiments deepen, his study of ancient magic elevating from curiosity to precision. He does not rush, he does not boast, he does not falter. You see him refining spells with the calm concentration of a calligrapher perfecting each stroke of ink, his wand movement smooth, measured, unobtrusive, his breathing steady, his posture unbroken. His early followers gather slowly around him, drawn by admiration, by fascination, by the allure of certainty in a world that feels increasingly uncertain. And though they cannot articulate why Tom inspires such devotion, they feel the gravity of his presence anchoring them, shaping their beliefs with the gentle persistence of a tide carving a shoreline. A third light joke brushes your thoughts as you imagine one overeager supporter gifting Tom a gaudy serpent-shaped brooch that he politely but firmly declines, his expression so courteously composed that the gift-giver walks away, convinced the rejection was actually a form of high praise. But beneath the faint amusement lies the truth of Tom's philosophy. Nothing ornamental, nothing wasteful, nothing out of place. Everything he chooses must serve his purpose. The memory softens as you follow him to a quiet cottage far from prying eyes, its windows shuttered, its rooms empty except for the table where Tom sits alone, the soft glow of a floating candle illuminating the parchment before him. On it, he has written names, not of enemies, not of friends, but of objects, places, histories, symbols. Some are circled, some are crossed out, some are left untouched. You sense in this moment the full weight of his ambition settling over the room like a veil of cold mist, not oppressive, but deliberate. His breath is slow, his posture is calm, his mind is a quiet storm. Time drifts forward. The wizarding world begins to sense a shift it cannot name, a subtle tightening in the air, a faint hum in magical spaces, like a storm gathering behind distant hills. Rumors circulate of a powerful wizard rising in influence, a man with charm forged into steel, a man whose name feels like it carries too much weight to belong to a mere ministry worker or shopkeeper or scholar. They say he speaks with a calm that unnerves even seasoned diplomats. They say he understands ancient magic in ways no one else has managed. They say he carries himself like someone who has never doubted the shape of his future. You watch him standing alone on a quiet hill overlooking the valley below, the wind tugging lightly at his cloak, the horizon stretching wide and open before him. The land does not know his name yet. The forests do not whisper it. The mountains do not echo it, but all of them will. And then, as the light fades around him, he closes his eyes, not in sorrow, not in rage, but in the calm, deep certainty of someone who has reshaped his bloodline, who has taken centuries of suffering and twisted it into a new axis upon which the world will turn. But as the story folds into its final breath, you return to the heart of the narrative, not to the rise of a dark wizard, not to the chaos he will one day unleash, but to the quiet truth that shaped the entire arc. The Gaunt bloodline, cursed and cracked, was never defined solely by its violence or misery. It was defined by longing. Merope's longing for gentleness, Morfin's longing for purpose, Marvolo's longing for pride, and Tom's longing for self-creation. Each generation reached outward, grasping for a future different from the one written for them. And though their paths diverged wildly, their story carries the same thread from beginning to end. The ache of wanting to be more than what the world decided they were. And now, as the final whisper of the Gaunt bloodline's tale settles into stillness, the air around you softens, the shadows lengthen, and the echoes of their story drift away like embers fading into night, quiet, persistent, and unforgettable. Good night.